not somebody that gets it together. So, all right, let's do that one, this one. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to have returning to the show Attorney Larry Altman. Remember, we've talked about Bully Navigator, the ultimate parent's guide to protecting your child from bullying and sexual violence at school. Attorney Altman, welcome.
Thank you so much. The honor is mine to be with you and your audience.
No, mine. Both of ours. How about that?
We'll agree on that.
Yeah. So a little bit about what you do, a little bit about your background.
All right. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be telling you I'm coming to you from my favorite coffee hangout, Revo Cup in Overland Park at Town Center, where the owners Brandon and Marve and their great baristas Lala and Sarah make the world's greatest coffee. So this is my morning hangout. This is my office, really.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll get out there sometime. I'd love to, hang out with you.
So my background is, to go back, is that I am a retired attorney. Originally lived in St. Louis, Missouri until about 11 years ago. For the last, say, 25 years, I've been deeply involved in helping children who have disabilities, mental health issues, discrimination. 11 years ago, I was asked to move across the state and help the Kansas City, Missouri Public School District because they were having some compliance issue with special education. And my wife, of who will be 49 years, says, "Guess what? We're going. I found you a job and we're moving." And I said, "Yes, dear," as I have said for 49 years.
Yes, dear.
So I did work there for about five and a half years, and then I guess I had told him, the original superintendent who hired me, that people were not going to like me very much in the school because I would demand compliance. And he said, "I've got your back." Sadly, he left, and it caught up with me is that I was unpopular and they didn't want to quite play the game as I wanted to play. So I retired from there. Currently, and I have been for 9 years, I am an adjunct professor at Avila University, Avila University in Kansas City, Missouri. I have taught graduate education students about special education. And for the last 6 or 7 years, I have taught undergraduate students who are in the business school. The class is called Introduction to Business Law, but I have converted it to a diversity, anti-discrimination, civil rights class. And so we spend our time discussing from the Constitution forward the ups and downs of our history in diversity, in civil rights, and anti-discrimination laws. I've written a couple books. You've mentioned one of them on sexual harassment and bullying. I've published around 19 to 20 papers on various topics helping children. And presently I'm waiting. I have a paper that's ready to be published on an update on mental health for children. I am working with 2 professors, one out of the University of Colorado, one from a professor from University of Oklahoma, where we are working on updating a article on school safety. And also they've asked me to help them with a publication that impacts disabled students who have autism, because schools seem to have some difficulty of how to handle those children. So that's me.
It's wonderful. Again, the work you do is so important and so wonderful. We talked about school shootings last time. I want to continue with some of that. It's what I just noticed, Attorney Altman, is I went on and I was going to search. I typed in school. I did on DuckDuckGo. I'm a paranoid, so I use DuckDuckGo, and it completed its shootings was one of the top ones to click on. I didn't even have to spell it out. I didn't have to spell shootings out. And that horrifies me. That it was.
Well, it should horrify everybody.
It should.
It is now the #1 topic that we are hearing to some degree, Louis, but here's what's happening, and I fear this. I think I shared with you just in the last 30 days, there have been 3 school shootings, 2 in Oakland, the same school, one in, I want to say, Philadelphia. From what I can tell, there was at least one fatality in the Philadelphia school, and there were no fatalities in Oakland. However, that was their second incident in 30 days. Other than the instant pop up on the internet, there has been no follow-up with those incidents, and I'm going to make a guess. It's because, thank God, there weren't enough deaths. It wasn't 10, 11, 12 children. We've grown, I guess, immune to it.
Yeah. Isn't that, forgive me for interrupting you, but isn't that bizarre? That
It's unacceptable.
I'm not saying that people would say, oh, another school shoot, it's just, it doesn't resonate unless it's a mass shooting.
I'm worried we're getting to that we've just gotten, I don't know what the word for it, but we've got acclimated. And I just read today, for example, not far from where I am now, is that over the weekend at a student prom at a Kansas City, Kansas, which is not far from here, school district, there was a drive-by at the school shoot and dance, homecoming dance. It appears no one was hurt, but they immediately had to evacuate and take the children out to safety who were attending a school dance, for goodness sake. And I suspect it because no one, except in the local area, thank God, because no one was killed, there'll be no national notice of it. And again, if you don't think about it, it doesn't happen. I guess that's the reality that some people take. And I find that unacceptable.
I agree with you. I've said about dealing with things and I'm talking about personal issues, but you deal with it, whatever it is, or it will deal with you. I'm thinking now, that's what's going on with school shootings. We're not dealing with it. We're just not.
You're right. You're right. And yet, I think I shared with you yesterday something that got published about a month ago, where an organization called, and I've got to look at my notes, I apologize for looking down,
please.
Called the Evertown for Gun Safety organization, published a very detailed paper about improving school safety. Now, I'm not doubting this, and I understand why they're doing it, but they spent 90% of the time talking about gun control. And I'm not downplaying that one bit, but Louis, you and I both know that once gun control is raised, then we hear the complaints about Second Amendment rights. Then we get into that argument and lose sight of what the goal really is. Now, they did spend some time, thankfully, on preventive measures. And it seems like I'm starting to see more and more, at least some people addressing that issue. And they said and they agreed with the United States Secret Service. They may not have known this. They said every one of these children that commits an act of violence, there's some warning about that child, and they're not talking about the day before. There's a history there. So at least there is some writings about it. An organization that I subscribe to called Special Ed Connection has now done a seminar about preventive maintenance, and maybe that's a beginning. At least that's what I hope.
Yeah, I hope so also. And again, people should be horrified about what's going on. And I'm dare say the lack of attention to it. I looked up school shootings this year, and the one from Insider, it's talking about 27 school shootings so far this year. That was in May. That was written in May. I hate going to past. It used to be, they were very rare, very rare. Now that it seems to be, I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it, Attorney Altman. It's like you say, it seems that unless there's a number of people killed a school shooting, it just doesn't seem to make the news. It may make it in local or regional news, just doesn't seem, or an afterthought elsewhere.
Well, I agree. And in the first week of school, there were on both coasts, there was at least one incident from the West Coast, one from the East Coast, in which a child was killed. Now, it was, quote, with a knifing. So I guess because it wasn't a gun, well, what's the big deal there? The child just got knifed to death. Okay, I happen to think that's a big deal. But it was only one. And so only, I say that's even a bad description. A single child was killed. Let's ask those parents what they think if that, God forbid, it was their child. Do you think they would just brush it off and say, well, gee, it was only my child? Really? I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Certainly not. Certainly they wouldn't. We talked last time a lot about the Secret Service and the report from the Secret Service. Talk a little bit more about that, if you will.
Well, going in the history of that, 2018, we had the Parkland shooting, which was just a disaster. In fact, that young man is in criminal trial. This has been and is being tried this week for murder, as I understand. Shortly after that, not as publicized, but certainly every bit as disastrous, there was a school shooting in Santa Fe, Texas. Now, while this was going on in 2018, the Department of Education was working on a major publication that they released at the end of the year about school safety issues. But the United States Secret Service apparently had been studying it for a period of time. And so Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos allowed them to release their first report. That summary of that first report is in my second book, where they said they made 8 points about what schools can do to prevent these incidences from coming up. And they recommended a threat assessment team to be created, that if there was a concern that about a child's history, whether grades were going down or they knew that the child had suffered some sort of a traumatic event, a parent dying, grandparent dying, whatever it might be, absences were increasing, or the people were reporting of threatening emails or pictures of death on papers, that would alert. If you had a team in place, that would be the kinds of things that would alert a team that would step in and then assess whether or not this child was spiraling downward, and could at some point pose either a threat to him or herself by suicide, or worse, take the gun into school and start shooting people. The service then said they had reviewed over 40 incidents, including Parkland, said they all were preventable if somebody had simply opened their eyes and taken an 8-step process. And then they laid out what that process should look like. 1 year later, they followed up in 2019, and they had done further studies and said that the number one causation of school violence was bullying. They had related over 80% of those incidents. There was bullying at some point, somewhere, somehow. And the schools either didn't take serious consideration of the bullying or didn't follow up, because the Secret Service and psychological publications had been telling us that, and this is for adults as well, that when you have a traumatic event such as bullying, that there is the increased chance of mental health issues, and one among those is depression, loss of self-worth, etc. And the outcomes can be disastrous if schools and public officials, and I'm including schools, can't do this alone. We're talking schools, parents, and corporate citizens, such as hospitals and mental health facilities, don't step in and say, hey, why don't we get this child some help? Parents may not be afforded, but let's just get it done. And that's what it's going to, as to quote somebody, and I know she is not the most popular person in the world, but she's right. It takes a village. And that's what it's going to require us to do.
She's not the most popular person in the world. I love that. I'm talking with Attorney Larry Altman live from the RoboCup Coffee House, your office, as you say. So what did you get this morning? What do you always get?
Today it was warm, so I got my standard iced latte. When it's winter, they make me a hot latte. Yeah. I'm easy to please.
Yeah, but it's very good. Always very good.
I walk in, and if it's cold, they know it's hot. If, like today, they were sure hot or cold. I said cold today.
Cold.
So, okay.
So it's warm? It's warm?
It's going to be in the 70s later today, and I consider that warm enough. But over the weekend, we were in the 30s, so they made it hot for me.
It's bizarre, right? I mean, the fluctuation of temperatures just is very, very bizarre to me. When one of the questions that I got from last time, if you could talk, and we've talked a lot about it, and you just talked about the relationship with bullying, and you and I were communicating about something close to here, an incident that happened close to in my area, where a girl brought a gun to school, and it's just, you hear that about bullying, and they get tired of it. It so negatively impacts them.
Oh, as I said, now, again, I am not a mental health care provider.
I understand.
Or that's not my field. So I do research. And when you, whether you like the government or not, one of the areas, the Department of Education, and there's also the other group that works with students with disabilities, does a great job of publishing clinical findings from other professions. And when you read the clinical findings from other professions, and since 2011, it has been known that traumatic events such as bullying, sexual harassment, parental loss, whatever, produces is a traumatic event. Once you have the traumatic event, they then said that the studies indicate that those children could, and I'm not saying always, may have developed some symptoms of PTSD, depression, etc. And that's going to, in the special education field, if a child is disabled, it requires us, for students who are already disabled under one of two federal laws, to look at the impact that incident has upon the child. And if the impact impedes with the ability of that child to receive what we call a free, appropriate public education, we have to take steps. Now, let's throw the big curveball in there. It's called COVID. And some states took the position that when the children were returning back to school, that they needed to do a preliminary mental health assessment of every child that came back because of the negative impact COVID had. Children couldn't socialize, they were stuck in their house, parents lost jobs, parents died or relatives died. So we have known for a significant length of time about what trauma does, not just to children. I read an article today where the military has a significant increase in suicides because of their service to our country, and they sacrifice a lot, but because of what's going on, what the service they did in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, all those places, that these heroes, and that's what they are, who wear the uniform of our country, have suffered terribly. And now the military is recognizing we got a problem here. So it's not confined just to children. Now, add on to that, there's the two other things that we have to be aware of. Again, clinical studies that said that if I observe as a bystander an event of bullying or sexual harassment, there's the data shows that I may suffer the same PTSD impact as the actual victim does. So we have something called the bystander effect. Then you add something else on, and people don't know they know what it's called, but they don't recognize it. It's called the anniversary effect, where on the anniversary of an incident, the person seems to go through as if it's today. And we've had students at Parkland. We had a parent at Sandy Hook who's 3 or 4 years later, on the anniversary of his child's death at Sandy Hook, took their lives. We had the same thing in Denver. So you put all those things out there together. Once you have this traumatic event, and if 80% of them is caused by bullying, to quote in the Matrix, when Mr. Smith goes to the leader and says, "I realize that you humans are a virus. You go to a place and multiply. We're the cure, you're the disease." Well, this stuff doesn't just end by the victim and the perpetrator who commits the bullying. We're talking about a whole group of other people who observed it, who have to live it again a year later. It just spreads. And that's when it comes back to why we have to, as a group, community, parents have their responsibilities also. I'm not saying parents get a pass here. And school officials have to work together as a team to address what we have today.
Attorney Altman, you say about parents, and in some, I don't know statistics, but there are parents that are not involved, that are not close with their kids. That's where I agree with, and the school has to take notice. People have to take notice of it, because there may be no parenting going on in some cases. So you can't rely on parents in some cases, certainly coming up and asking for help, et cetera, but not in all cases. The child has to be observed, like you said, and the behavior.
Well, it's not just the behaviors. There are things called grades. There are things called attendance.
Right. Yeah.
There are other things to observe. And then again, when you do your collection of what I call, of what data do I want to collect, this is what I teach my students. When we're doing policy, protocols, and procedures, a critical component of that, if we were trying to resolve an issue such as lessen the improve school safety and improve educational outcomes, what data do we need to collect so that we can determine that this is the child that needs to be referred for a threat assessment? You have to do that very carefully, because even this other paper I've talked about the other day that just got out a month ago, we don't want to do racial profiling, forbidden. So we have to get into the details of what it is that I want to collect that will give me the what we call the note, hey, I got to take another step here. And I do agree with, and these publications are saying this as well. Discipline is not the answer. Kicking the child out of school, putting them in a secluded area of the school, in and of itself is not. And that's not saying sometimes seclusion for a timeout room for a bit. Sure. I'm not debating that, but to isolate the child completely, remove the child completely from the school environment is not. It may be quick, but it's not the best choice in every single circumstance. And this paper written by this organization puts that forth. That's what happened to the child in Parkland, is that he became an adult. He was having some issues regarding the placement where he wanted to go to school. When the public school system offered him a plan, he rejected it, and they said, "That's fine. You're done with us. You don't get any services now." Well, it just cascaded from there. What did they think was going to happen? Because the child made a decision you didn't like, you decided this child didn't even get the same access to counseling as the general education population received, because he wouldn't listen to what the school said. And now he's 18. He hadn't been declared incompetent. He gets to make his own call. I got that. It's frustrating. But to totally basically punish him, and just say, well, we're just not going to do anything for you. And that includes, if you need to see a counselor, no, you wouldn't take our plan. And that's part of the evidence going down in this trial in Florida right now.
That's part of the evidence.
That will be the defense that they will put out there, is that because he may be facing, I don't know if Florida has the death penalty or not.
I don't either.
But at some point, if I was trying to help, I'm not excusing him for the murder.
Certainly
but
not.
Is the death, but on the other hand, death penalty for a 19, 20-year-old, when there were other contributing factors, and I think they're supposed to take, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but someone has to take a step back from that for a moment and understand that society failed him as well. That doesn't excuse the bad choice he made.
That's absolutely.
I'm not excusing that. He needs to pay a price for that. You don't go and kill people. But at the same time, let's take a step back, take a deep breath of we have to understand a little bit that there is some, and some of your listeners may disagree with that, but there were some contributing factors of that, not all his, that may require somebody to say the death penalty is not, this is not some guy that went out, I'm going to go rob a bank and kill people. That's not what happened here. He did make a plan to kill people. He needs to pay that price. But does he pay the ultimate price of and I believe Florida does have the death, should he be put to death for this? And I would debate maybe not.
Attorney Altman is my guest, live from the River Cup Coffee House. I love that. I love when we first did that last time. When you think about social media, and I've had people that have emailed me about this, that effect, and I know we've talked about, but social media, there was bullying where, when I was young, got bullied, it was, big guys or whatever, for whatever reason, pushing you up against the lockers or whatever. It's so different today with social media and bullying.
No doubt about it.
You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a physical or someone saying to your face in the hallway or whatever, bullying you in that regard. With social media, it's so different. Can you address that? Will you address that?
Sure. Actually, the state of Missouri did this, and so what occurred is that in prior to 2016, the state of Missouri legislature for schools had a definition for bullying, and then an incident took place, and I'm going to suspect it was in St. Louis County because of who introduced the bills to the state legislature, that we had read that a University of Missouri student, because of the online bullying and sexual harassment, including the posting of inappropriate pictures, took her life. And the Missouri legislature woke up and said, not woke up, did a great job in this, said, hey, we've got to expand bullying definitions and those things that go with it, and include online bullying as prohibited behaviors that the schools may address. And so they rewrote and expanded significantly the anti-bullying statutes in Missouri. And I was honored with the task of chairing the task force to create what we call a model anti-bullying policy, where we talk about that online bullying is now prohibited. It is subject to the same types of discipline responses as any other form of bullying. Not too many months ago, the United States Supreme Court, in a First Amendment, the argument then about online bullying is, well, doesn't that violate the First Amendment free speech rights? You have to go through the history of the Supreme Court and the First Amendment for students. And the Supreme Court over the years has said it's not exactly the same. You and I have different rights not being in the school versus K through 12 students. And a case was published earlier this year where a high school student did not make the varsity team for cheerleading, got home out of frustration and said, F you, varsity cheer. And the school disciplined that student. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the judge said, time out here. F you, Supreme Court, does not indicate any kind of danger, disruption. It is not a threat. It's none of the above. That's protected by the First Amendment. But they reminded us in their sentences that if the student had said, and they didn't use these words, I am going to kill the teacher that did not put me on the varsity team, that would not have been protected speech for that youngster. That would have been a threat.
Right.
And so they've even the Supreme Court has again reminded us that there are limits and that they will enforce those kinds of statements, symbols that can be interpreted very easily. I don't know, that's not even good. Can be considered a threat or an act of racism. One of the arguments around that hasn't ever reached the Supreme Court is whether or not students can wear the Confederate battle flag. And there are a significant number of federal court judges who say, no, you can't, because that's a symbolism of racism. And students are offended by it.
It's interesting.
So that's, and I argued one of those cases. And it's disruptive, and that's a standard. Is it or could it be disruptive? All in response to the online stuff we are seeing today.
And it seems to be it's getting worse from everything I understand. Think about some of the things, Attorney Altman, about why schools are not embracing or not coming up with protocol or policy or whatever, or having a team and doing these things that work and need to be implemented by the schools. Do you think it's maybe a power trip or something with school administrators and school boards where they don't want to?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. We're again asking schools to do a lot without additional funding. Let's start with that.
Okay.
And the second thing of it is, and I had to get this through to my former employee, is that they think it's easier to respond than it is to prevent. It's, quote, cheaper. Well, they're wrong, by the way. And then you talk about the time consumption of having yet another task force in your school that has to first create the policies, then has to monitor the policies, and then make sure they're fully implemented every single time. I got all that. I understand that. And it's, quote, not easy. I'm not here to tell you that that's the easiest thing in the world to do. I use this as a technique, and it's one of many out there. What I consider one of the best techniques to do that is called the Malcolm Baldridge model. And it's a 4-step process. It is the Cadillac of doing development of policies. It is what I teach every one of my students to do in their classwork, by the way. But it's time consuming. It's all of these things. I can lay out all the excuses, all right?
But they are excuses.
I can also, Yeah, and that's what they are. But again, I understand you need help. The schools cannot do this in a, especially if I'm talking about reviewing psychological potential issues that can impact a child. Schools are not psychiatrists. They're not in the business of providing mental health. You need outside assistance. We had that at Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools from Children's Mercy that I know, at least based upon what I received while we were doing it, that we were told by the healthcare provider at Children's Mercy who helped us with our planning that they believe we saved the lives of 2 children. So let's ask those parents what that's worth. So let's go back and I'll compare the cost with you. Well, let's talk about the cost of doing the preliminary work to make sure we do the assessments and we collect the data. Now, let's compare that to the cost of now we've had this disaster.
Yeah.
Well, what's the first thing you hear the schools doing? Well, we got to bring in experts to meet with every child and every parent and da 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 because we know there's going to be trauma and stuff like this. We know that we've made these folks always available and they go through all the steps and then they have all the hearings like you haven't where the entire police force, I understand Uvalde was dismissed yesterday.
Yes.
Talk about all that stuff went on. Let's compare that cost. If you're going to talk dollars versus the cost of implementing a policy so you didn't have to do this back end stuff. I'm going to give you a guess. It would be cheaper. And let's not, I don't even talk about the human cost. Dollars and cents, it would be cheaper to do it before than respond. And let me again ask anybody on your listening audience, tell me what the life of one child, how many dollars do they want for their child? I mean, my dad used to kid me as a child that he would have sold me for a nickel. And I got that, okay? But he's the same guy that said I was delivered by a buzzard. What can I tell you? But
that you were delivered by a buzzard?
A buzzard. I wasn't delivered by the stork. I was delivered by a buzzard.
Buzzard.
So, I mean, I got that. But the bottom line is, and how, again, I can go by my experience. When we put in at Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools, all the preventive measures on sexual harassment, bullying, and mental health, and because of that, and I don't mean we rolled over when a parent asked us something, we didn't always do it. We followed the law. But twice a year, I met with the risk management team and the insurance company who would ask us how we were doing. And because of the diligent work of preventive maintenance we were doing, we cut the cost of outside legal fees to almost nothing, reducing the cost, at least keeping insurance costs level versus getting an increase 10% every year. Okay, was it worth it? Let's ask the parents because that gave us more money in a poor school district to buy more computers, more books. I think that the cost comparison was worth it. That's my experience of 5 years.
Certainly worth it. When you say that, it's certainly worth it. And on so many levels, like you're saying, on so many levels. And what's the cost of the death of one child? But implementing it, you were talking about that 4-step process that you use and you teach your students.
Yes, well, let me go through it again. It's called Malcolm Baldridge, and think of an inverted triangle. At the top of the triangle is what we call this is where we gather information at the top of the triangle. We get stakeholders from the school and bring in what do we need to do to solve a problem. Part 2, then we write out the policies. Part 3 is implementation, and 4th is the goal we achieve. Now, it may be at the bottom of the pyramid, and this is what throws people off. But the first thing you do is what are you trying to accomplish? So you're at the bottom of the pyramid first. What are we trying to accomplish? What is our goal or goals? Well, the first answer I get from administrators, we want to be legally compliant. No, that's not the goal. The goal is to improve school safety so that children's academic performances increase. Now, by doing that, the outline, if you go below that, the natural outcome is that, yes, we will improve, we will remain compliant, reduce the cost of our insurance and legal fees. But the goal is to improve school safety. So now let's go back to the stakeholders, the top. It's called input. And input, you bring in what we call stakeholders. In a school, you bring in, and you have to, when we were doing the bullying policy for Missouri, one of the 2 people they left out of our meetings at first were the parents and children. And I said, we can't do this without going around the state and talking to parents and children. But what would they like us to do if we had a bullying policy? You gather this input as all of you do, and now it's time to write policies, protocols, and procedures. Then the question, and I asked my students, and they're shaking their heads about that in their rubrics. How do you know it works? And that comes to the data collection. So you have to make it data sensitive. So that's another debate. What data do I collect? How often do I review it? Now, what is called step 3 on the pyramid actually is the 4th step. It's implementation, meaning we've got to put this and make sure. If we write 10 rules we say there are 10 things we're going to do for a special needs child. We are going to do those 10 things every single time without fail. Because if we only do 9 and we don't implement it, why do we have the policy? And too often I see policies in place that are great policies, but nobody bothers to implement. I'm testifying in a case that's like that. They have this pretty good policy. But, oh, by the way, they just decided not to implement it here. Well, great, let's just throw the policy out then. Why do we have it? We put a lot of work in. You wasted your time. So 4 steps, and my students walk through that. And as undergraduates, it's difficult because I have told them, and I've repeated, this is really a graduate level project. But I still think that these young people, even at an undergraduate level, need to go through the mechanism of figuring out how to do problem solving. And that's why I teach what I do.
I love that about you. And they need to, it'll be invaluable for them as they go on in life, having that, being able to set that like that, to follow that, to understand what's the goal, and then developing it. I think that's wonderful. You can't say any, or can you say anything else about the case that you're in?
Well, the only thing I can say about the case is that it involved a student athlete, and they had a policy about behaviors that student athletes were held to a higher level of behavior, if you will, than the general population, because they represented the school. They wore the school emblem when they were competing. And this is, by the way, a common problem, that athletes seem to get special exceptions to the rule. In their rule, they said that if a child who is on a team does something that is unacceptable, the coach has the right to add discipline on to what the school has already imposed upon that student. What they did for this athlete is they never told the coach. So the coach had no chance of implementing whatever discipline he or she might have wanted to implement, including kicking the student off the team. And then there's a massive event. Event number 3 is massive. I mean, now we've really got a disaster on our hands. The response from the school district is, well, we had some discretion in telling the coach. Why have the rule?
Yeah.
Why did you bother to write the rule? Is there? And if this was the case, I mean, let's go back to 2014, whether you liked him or not. President Obama in April of 2014, and rarely did he get angry in public, said he had received a report from the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, that schools, major universities, if you were an athlete representing the university, was ignoring accusations of sexual harassment against their team players. And he said that is unacceptable. Everybody plays by these rules, and we don't care if the child is an athlete or not. One of my alma maters, I have 2, but the one I am so proud of, I'm proud of both. I'm a Washington University and St. Louis graduate. I'm also St. Louis University Law School graduate. I will say that he's still the coach of the St. Louis University Billikens. That's what we're called. First year as the coach in a program that was in a disaster situation. He's trying to improve the program. And 2 of his star athletes are accused of violating the school's sexual harassment policies. And as soon as he heard that and read what went on, he kicked them off the team. They only won 5 games that year. But the university and parents around the country applauded this coach because it was more important for him to send a message that if you're going to play for me, you're not in that stuff. We're done here. And that's what's supposed to happen. And to this very day, and he's still the coach, and he's got a team that's very good this year because, and I don't know this for a fact, but I would bet you that there are parents of athletes would say, there's a debate between two schools, but this coach isn't going to tolerate nonsense. I'm going to send my child there. And that's what we should be doing, and we don't. So the case I had was what I would call the typical 2014 situation. You're an athlete, pass.
Yeah. I mean, even and not compare back of 50 years ago, I remember how some of the athletes were revered, certainly by some students. And again, they were great athletes, whatever. There was no incident, but it was obvious to the other students that the administration favored them. I don't know how I probably shouldn't get
What
into
did we
too
see
much
in
of it.
grades? They weren't showing up to class and they were getting A's because somebody was taking their test. Now, I'm not saying that goes on today, but that was the first antenna raiser where schools were, quote, giving these students, they weren't really educating them. They were giving them a free pass because they were great athletes leading their school to victory.
Yeah.
Forgetting that their number one job as a university is, I thought, education.
That's what I thought also. Attorney Altman, you can stay a little bit, or do you need to get another latte?
Yeah.
Do you need another latte?
No, I'm good.
But okay. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland, copyright B. Free Radio Limited 2022, produced by the lovely Ms. Bunny Face in cooperation with White Rabbit Productions. I'm talking with Attorney Larry Altman live from the Rebel Cup Coffee House. Where's your second office, right? Or your office?
Correct.
Main office.
It's my main office.
Yeah. We're talking obviously about school shootings and bullying, et cetera, and preventing them. I'm going to ask you again, why aren't more schools doing this? You said they can blame it. They can use all of the excuses. And I don't like to think of government forcing them. I don't like the idea of government forcing things, but what's it going to take?
Well, the Secret Service in their closing comments said it takes leadership and common sense. And there seems to be a lack of that, but I'm going to take a shot at my own profession. These school districts have attorneys, and they have access to the same information. That's what part of our job. It was part of my job at KC Public Schools. Something gets published that it might impact my department. It was my obligation to read it, write about it, and alert people that we need to do something about it. I'm going to start there and saying that too many of my colleagues tend to ignore it. Now, I'll get all sorts of pushback. Oh, how dare you say that about us? But I've seen it. I know it. Before I worked for the school, I was in private practice. I ran into school lawyers that after I trumped them in a case, they patted me on the back and said, gee, thanks for that, Lair. Now I get to charge them more money to train them.
Oh.
And I'm sitting there going, why, if you had done the training beforehand, you wouldn't be here today, and your insurance company wouldn't be writing my client a check with 6 numbers on. What's that about? So it happens. That's the leadership, part of the leadership situation. If you're not in that office with that superintendent or your board as a lawyer, that's your job. I wonder, for example, just this week, a couple of days, or maybe late last week, there was an incident in one of the Salt Lake colleges. That a student was removed from the classroom because she was late in her pregnancy, and the school says, "Oh, there's nothing we can do about that," and wouldn't even refund her tuition. The Office of Civil Rights stepped in and said, "You violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You violated Title IX. You did all these things." And guess what? We had last week come out a directive from the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education saying, "Hey, this isn't right. You guys do this again, you got a real problem on your hands." So where's the lawyer in that? I mean, I know it.
Yeah.
And come on, folks, I can't be the only person in the world that receives these reports from the Department of Education. And you just mentioned it, Louis. The last thing I want is Congress to make anything mandatory on schools.
I
is that really what we have to do here to get this done? Please tell me no. But I'm worried that if we aren't proactive, if we don't show leadership and common sense, there's going to come a point in time where Congress is going to pass a bill and says, that directive that the Secret Service said was, a suggestion. We're just going to make it the law.
Well,
Gee, do you really want to do that? No, I
no.
don't want that either.
Yet, again, if they don't, that's probably what's going to
There's
happen.
the
Like I
outcome.
said, yeah, that's, they don't, and then it's going to become law. And then who knows, once it becomes law, well, you know better as a lawyer, there'll be people that will challenge the law. And I see that as a nightmare, a bit of a nightmare.
Well, and it's, as I said, and I even get chuckles. I used to get chuckles into the Office of Civil Rights. They currently, under Title IX and under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, they have, if you're a public school, in any school or college that takes federal funding, you have to comply with those laws. You can parents can file a complaint with those agencies. If they find you out of compliance, then you enter into what is called a resolution agreement, where they monitor you for 3 to 5 years. I refer to that as the red ants have just gotten into your school and you can't get them out. And they're biting you all the time. Is that really what you want? And my answer was no. And I got a chuckle when we did combined meetings. The Missouri School Board Association and the OCR would come up and I would call them red ants. And even the director patted me back and says, "That's a great description."
I love your sense of humor with that.
He thought that was pretty cool. He said, "Red ants, Larry, I hadn't thought of that."
Yeah.
But that's what they are.
Yeah. And with that, again, if they don't implement something, some policy, that will, I agree with you, and I'm horrified by it, but it will happen. Hard or easy, it's going to happen. I still, and again, I know I'm repeating a lot, don't understand why more schools aren't embracing it. And I get it's going to take resources. They could get community partners, correct? Like you were talking about,
I said,
community partners with the evaluations, correct?
And you've got, again, I'll go to my other alma mater, Washington University in St. Louis, who was asked by my longtime high school for help with issues such as this. And Washington University, at no cost to the University City School District, stepped in and helped them develop a plan to improve school safety. All they had to do was ask. And there's never a bill sent from Washington. There was never a bill done for Washington University. They just did it because they're corporate citizens. They have many of their own staff in that community. So they knew that if they have staff members with children in that district, of course we're going to help them because we want our staff to stay. There was never a bill sent from Washington U. And how they did it was they called it a research project. Well, that meant they got funding.
Yeah.
But look, I don't care how they did it, but they accomplished the task. And that's what it takes. Washington University, in that case, St. Louis University, in the other case, stepped up to the plate. In my community, Children's Mercy stepped to the plate and said, "Hey, we're here to help. These are our children too. We're going to help you guys." So it's there.
And Children's Mercy
is a hospital organization in the Kansas City metro area.
And they did evaluate.
What they did with us is we were reaching out to them. We knew that we had to expand. We were already in Title IX. We were in bullying, but because of the research we had done, we knew mental health was an issue. And that we were getting reports of children hurting themselves, talking about hurting themselves. And so I'm not a doctor, and we had a counselor, and one of the counselors said, "Maybe we ought to talk to somebody. What about Children's Mercy?" And I made a contact and told them what we were looking for. I said, "Why don't we send somebody over to help you guys?" And they helped us develop a checklist, one-page checklist that we put online for all of our staff and for our staff. In addition, they said, "We know that you're an inner city school. We know that many of your parents cannot afford mental health services. Whatever Medicaid provides as a payment, that's all we need. We'll do the rest." So we then developed policy, protocols, and procedures. We had a reporting system. I was in charge of getting that report. And then we had policy set up who I would send it to for review. Namely, we'd send that to the counseling service and the head of student affairs. Also, because we had a computer system, if a child came in, Joe Smith, school ID number 1212, it popped that into 1212, child number 1212. 2 incidents that I remember. We got the reports, we did the checklist, we informed the parents, it's part of the policy, but it didn't meet the criteria for getting Children's Mercy involved. few months later, though, a second report comes in on 2 of these children. And the software, and you interviewed Steve Cohen, it's his son who developed the software, because of the ID number connected the 2 students. Now we have a second incident. Checklist said there, that has to go to Children's Mercy with the parents' permission. We did it. I don't know what happened after that, but several months later, on both students, the superintendent of the school got a letter that said, thanks to the work done by your teams, you probably saved a child's life.
That's
couldn't do that without Children's Mercy.
You make me tear up a little bit hearing that.
So,
I mean,
again, I throw it out to everybody who's listening today. Ask those parents, how many dollars was that worth? Sure, it took up my time. Sure, it took up my teammates' time. Sure, it took up the superintendent, the assistant. And so what? There are 2 children that were alive because we worked with Children's Mercy. We had a policy in place. We followed it. And then we get, to me, the greatest letters of all. You saved somebody's life today.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's very powerful and very beautiful. And like you say, what is it worth? I have to ask you, Attorney Larry Altman, and I probably have asked you this before, what drives you? You are so dedicated, so passionate about this.
Well, I'm going to step back and first give credit to that. And I told you this before. I've been married almost 49 years to a beautiful young lady by the name of Gail. Any good I've done in this world is because of her. We met at Washington University in St. Louis. She received a degree in teaching children who had hearing impairments from Washington University. I was a physics major at the time that I went to law school. I hated being a lawyer for 25 years and was ready to quit. She was retiring. She says, I've got a gift for you. Why don't you look into this law of special education? And I fell in love with it.
Wow.
And then I realized that the most important asset we have in this world is our children.
Sure.
What drove me further is that then I take the job at the Kansas City, Missouri Public School District. And although I had read about children in an inner city, I had not seen in full view where the only times these children got fed most of the day, as many of them was breakfast and lunch we provided them.
Yeah.
And that they were victimized by society. And I said, that's it. We're done here. I've got to push this envelope even further. And so that's what I do. And I have 2 grandchildren. So now I've got a real emphasis. They deserve better than what we have now. And so my wife and I work together to try to make that better.
That's wonderful. Again, you had to embrace it. Again, I understand what you're saying about Gail, about your wife. You embraced it and ran with it. She opened the door and you
I had to go through it.
Yeah, you ran in and continue to.
This is what I do. That's why I contacted you again when this issue came up. You were so kind to invite me on your program.
I'm honored.
And as I said, and I'm not done just with this. I'm working with, I continue to listen. My students provide me. I'll be back in the classroom tomorrow morning, and they do more for me than I do for them. They don't, and I've told them that. You guys, stand around, walk around those, because I break them in their teams and they work on their group projects at the last part of the class. Go around and talk to these 45, 47 young people, man. If that doesn't give you an adrenaline rush, nothing will. They're great.
Yeah, that's and I love that. But again, you have to be open to it. You're open to it. Some block that off, or their ego takes over.
Can't be. No, I got to put ego aside, and they know they can disagree with me. I get homework and as I said, I never give tests. I give homework. What are the 5 most important things that you learn in order of importance? For that very reason. And one of them wrote something, and I know that it took a lot of. We had a guest speaker. They thought the guest speaker didn't do all the things that person did a very good job and missed some points. I'm sure that student thought, will the professor take that out of me? Got a perfect score from me because he or she did it correctly. And I wrote him, says, I am proud of you because you told me what you needed to know and what you didn't get. That alerts me to something. And that's what I encourage my kiddos to do.
And when you say about putting ego aside, you just reminded me of something many, many, many decades ago. Professor he's no longer around, but professor at the university here would always say, if you asked a question or something, he'd say, I have more degrees than anyone else at this university. I mean, he would shut shut people down.
No, I mean, I get it. If I argue with another lawyer who doesn't know his or her stuff, yeah, my ego will get in that and I'll shut them down in a minute. That's the end of that nonsense.
Yeah,
That's different.
that's
My
different than a
students
student.
know that they can come to me with anything as long as it's professionally and politely done. And then I give them the dad joke of the day to close the day. But it's like the other day, I'm hearing the students in one team saying, one of the young students was saying, I'm shaking their head, I just don't know what I'm doing. And I'm standing back listening to the conversation. I said, the only person that doesn't know what they're doing in this classroom is me. So don't worry about it.
Self-deprecating.
That guy, everybody rolled over when I told them that, no, professor, you're the only one that does know what they're doing.
Self-deprecating humor, though, it is, and it's great. And it's, you say that, and again, it opens them up and it shows the warmth and understanding, and you self-deprecate, and they appreciate it.
I'm there for them. It's their class, not mine, is what I tell them.
Wow, you're an incredible human being. Again,
I don't know about that.
I do.
I appreciate that.
I do. I appreciate you. You've enlightened, you've educated so many people about these issues and continue to drive forward about it. Again, I'm stunned, appalled, upset that not enough schools are implementing some policy regarding this, was suggested, the Secret Service, et cetera. I've got to ask you, can you give us a quick dad joke?
Sure. I got to think which one. Okay, so a friend of mine just got back from Africa, right? And I said, John, what'd you do in Africa? He says, well, I took pictures of all these elephants, either in groups or when they were by themselves with their young. And I said, John, did any of the elephants charge you? He said, no, Larry, they let me take their picture for free.
You crack me up. I love your dedication so much.
I love your show, Louis. You give me it's a great honor. You give me the openness to let me talk, and I appreciate that, my friend. You're the best.
You're the best. So you're saying I'm a self-deprecator too. So you will, I'm assuming that means we're going to update soon.
Yes, I will. As I said, when I get stuff published, Louis, I will send it to you. If there's a topic there, even if it be this, or as I said, I'm working with the students and with two professors that are working with students with autism because they're being warehoused too easily by schools. If these are topics that once I send you my publications, if they get published that you think the audience would want to listen to, I'd be honored to come back.
Well, it would be my honor. Can you take a minute and talk about the issue with this students with autism?
Yeah, the concern that the professors have is that too often the schools believe the easiest way to deal with that is to put the children in an all-day program doing a particular form of services for children. I want to call it ABA, and I may be saying that wrong. And they're greatly concerned about that because they're warehousing the children. They know it's wrong, but how do we address it, not only from the parents' point of view, but from the school's point of view? Well, let's step back in. There's a federal law called the Individual Disability Education Act that says in its opening comments that students who have disabilities, and these autistic children may qualify under that law, that they must be educated to the maximum extent possible in the least restrictive environment. Now, what that means is the federal law of special education, or IDEA, from its creation, was to make certain these children were with general education students as much as possible because that was beneficial to the children. And that total seclusion from that general education environment was rarely required. Instead, what schools had to do was put in services and accommodations that would allow the child to spend some time in the general education environment. Now, too often, though, it's just easy. Let's just ship them out. And I saw that. One of my first tasks at the Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools is that they had a segregated school where they put children just there all day, and there was no progress. And that was one of the questions that the superintendent asked me to deal with. And I said, and they were planning on closing the school. And even the parents who had children at school were afraid to bring these children back because they were secure and safe there. And I remember the first thing he did, there was a a public forum, and he was getting yelled and screamed at, and he said, "Get in there and protect me." And so very calmly, I explained to them what we needed to do, and I understood the bullying issue, and I said, that's on us. Once they got the school that merged in a building next to a general education high school where the kids would interact, all those parents that were afraid, once they saw what we were doing, that lessened it, and it also improved their educational outcomes. That's what federal law requires us to do. And so we don't warehouse, we don't seclude, and we don't restrain every day. We have to think of other things. That you go through a whole litany of steps first before you absolutely seclude a student from the general education population. And so my mission is they're going to write the educational components. I'll write the legal side to brace that up.
That's fantastic. And again, to warehouse them, there's not going to be progress. I have to tell you, very quickly, Attorney Altman, I worked with an engineer, a radio engineer, number of years ago, since passed. The greatest, the best engineer, could fix everything, could enhance, just amazing. He had Asperger's autism, so there were some things that were obvious, but it was great. Another author that I've had on, children's author, Tom Engelberger, who is books have sold literally around the world, millions of copies, autistic.
There's no doubt.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. And so that's what the problem is. And so they need to be, look, the real world is not, in theory, we're not supposed to lock people away because they're autistic or because they have a disability or because they're blind or because they're hearing impaired. That's right. That's what it is. So my mission in this is to make sure that we put together a couple of flow charts, one for the schools to use as a checklist, one for the parents as a checklist, to say, here's what needs to be done before you make that drastic step, total seclusion. That's what I will help develop. But they will do the educational component side. Again,
for them, like you say, to warehouse them, and it's for something that is no fault of their. If you put a kid in detention or whatever, it's something they did. This is something that happened to them, or is something that is in them, not something that they did, and it's unconscionable to think about them warehoused.
But all you have to do is watch the beginning of Forrest Gump and remember what Sally Field had to do, because Forrest was going to be put in one of those schools. That's what it was. And one of the goals of the special education laws was to end that.
And it's still going on.
It sadly is with anything else. Sometimes school officials say it's just easier to, if we don't have to see it, we don't have to deal with it.
Yeah. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Absolutely. That's what it is.
You're incredible. You really are.
I appreciate that, my friend.
I do want to continue this discussions with you, Attorney Larry Altman. You're such a bright light, such a gem in our world.
I appreciate that.
Really, I appreciate you. We'll do it again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louis, and to your guests and your listeners. Thank you so much for your time. Take care now.
Thank you. Again, he is an incredible human being. Attorney Larry Altman.